Hi, my name is Nicholas Edwards, and I'm doing a presentation on video game sales worldwide. I chose this topic because video games interest me a lot, so I wanted to know how well they were selling just about everywhere. My three data-driven questions were, what genre of games sells best in each area? I said America and Europe probably sell shooters the best, and Japan probably sells role-playing the best. Another question I had was, what publisher had the best releases per year? I said that Nintendo would probably have very solid sales all around, but maybe I'm forgetting some big publisher. My last data-driven question was, what genre does each publisher usually release? I said that Nintendo probably has a lot of platformers, Activision a lot of shooters, and Sony probably a lot of puzzle or platformers. If you want to talk about my data set, it has over 16,000 games individually. It goes over not only their sales in each area, but their publisher, genre, year, platform, and rank, but I never really used that. To find my data set, I went to Kaggle and searched video game sales. And honestly, it was my first option, but it was the best considering it had more specifically genre, publisher, and sales for each area. So I could limit and filter the games that I wanted. Going on to my survey, I have a couple of questions that I asked them. First being, do you even play or watch video games? 3 of them answer that as yes. 1 is no. If you choose no, the survey ends because the rest won't apply. The other questions that I had were, genre of game do you usually play, with a mix of all different types of games, and one with none in case you don't actually play anything. Same with watch, with none just in case you don't actually watch anything. And I also asked, what video game publisher do you think has the best sales per year on average? A little short answer for them to write in any publisher that they can think of. Then 2 quick questions on how well do you think blank sells in blank. Role-playing sells in Japan, and shooters sells in America/Europe. A scale from 1 to 5. A little short answer for what is your age and what continent do you live in, just so I know where I'm looking. If we begin looking at the responses for what I had, most of us lived in North America. That means I can take the majority of this information to be people from North America. And as a general consensus, what games do you usually play and watch came out as action and shooter as the top 2, which is what I expected. This answers my data-driven question on which area sells the best genres. Skip this one. I fucked up. If we look at the last question and its responses, we can see that most of us are from North America, meaning I can take most of this data as North Americans. Unsurprisingly, the first option for each of these, what do you usually play and what do you usually watch, is shooter/action, which is what I expected, which answers one of my data-driven questions. What area has the best-selling genre? What genre sell best in each area? Skip this one again because I'm an idiot. If we look at the responses and look at this last question, we can see that most of us are from North America, meaning I can take most of this data as North Americans. Looking at the first 2 questions, what do you usually play and what do you usually watch, shooter and action come up as the top candidates, which answers my second. Skip this one again. Looking at the responses, with that last question, we see what continent do you live in, most of them being in North America. If we look back up, as the first 2 questions, what games do you usually play/watch, we can see that shooter and action come up as the top 2 candidates, which is what I expected. This answers my first data-driven question, what genre of game sells best in each area, and solidifies what I said. America and Europe like shooter the best, though action was just behind. If we look at Google Trends graphs, we can see that when looking up Japanese RPG and American RPG, Japanese being the blue, American being the red, we can see that at the beginning of 2005, they were very high and slowly died down until just now, in which there's a lot less than what they were. The spike in popularity in June 2007 is, from what I can find, to be a game named Eternal Sonata that came out around that time. While I didn't use filters to sort out the answers because of the limited questions and responses, I instead looked at each column individually. With this first question, I didn't have to do much since it was just a multiple choice answer, and they can't mess that up. Same with the ones that asked for a number for popularity of genres in each area, as they were predetermined choices. When I asked for what type of games people played or watched, I made sure to only really answer the questions that made with the other option. Let's get this one again. Most of the issues with the data that the survey was able to gather were some things with set membership issue, with people not naming genres, but actual names of games, and others wrote genres that I felt were already on the list, and I changed those. These were all problems with the questions that had the other option, which they were able to write whatever they wanted. Another issue I formatted out was that, get this part out. Another issue that I had to fix was with the age question, which some people actually wrote out with words their age instead of numbers. Lastly, I got rid of an entire row that just picked every answer physically possible to them, which I know couldn't be introduced as an actual answer, seeing as one of the genres they picked was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That couldn't be real. Here's a small summary table showing each of the individual responses separated by time. If you look over to the right in each of these columns, you'll see what they rated for the popularity of specific genres in specific areas, ending with nearly 4.5 for the second column and 4 for the first one, meaning they're relatively high, meaning that supported my first data-driven question on what genres sell best in each area. This last survey table, or pivot table, whatever you want to call it, is based on my data set. And it just shows a summary of all of the sales that each general publisher made, even the smallest ones. The top result was Nintendo, which answers another one of my data-driven questions: which publisher sells the most in general? I found this graph online showing the sales of video games in the United States in 2012. The first two sales would be action and shooter, which is a little off from what I said, but at least shooter is still up there, much farther ahead than third place sports games. I was surprised to find that using my data set and making graphs out of it, that action actually sold the best over time in all three graphs that I created. Sports being the second most for this one specifically. This actually goes against my data-driven question, which I thought that shooters would be the top selling genre in each of these areas. Going to my data studio, you can actually see that in Japan, role-playing is the top seller. Oops. Skip this one. If you go to my data studio, we can see that role-playing is the top seller in Japan with both of these graphs. This graph down here actually shows the EU sales all added together. It actually shows that action is the top seller in EU, followed by sports, and then a little bit lower, shooter, which is not directly supporting evidence, but it does show some data for one of my data-driven questions. For my final program, I had this program just take some of the previous programs and makes them to one organized single program. Option 1 will give you an overview of my project. Option 2 will give you my data-driven questions. Option 3 will give you some basic stats. Option 4 will give you some visuals for basic data. Option 5 will give you visuals for my survey. Option 6 will give you visuals for my data set. Option 7 will give you answers to my questions with graphs. And option 8 will just end the program. Naturally, this program used a lot of variables. Most importantly, probably the valids that I have around. seeing if something is true or false, and giving an error if it happens to be false. Others would be variables that have actual numbers attached to them so they can display later on, like here, RPG with a number saying that role-playing games have sold that number of times. Conditional statements were specifically important when I was talking about many different options that the user can take. Say for here, if they chose option 1, they'd be shown a linear rating graph. Option 2, another linear rating graph, but for a different subject. Option 3, a count. And option 4, it would just end. But this else if statement would be a conditional. Here would be a loop. While it asks for what some input equals, if it is blank, it'll ask for an input. It would be whatever you inputted, hopefully a number. Because if it's not a number, it would turn out false and give you an error. If it is, then it would change it into an integer for later programming to not mess up. Functions would be the most important part of this project. To define a function, you would first need to do def space, whatever you want to call the function, whatever arguments you put into it, and a semicolon. After that, you can put in whatever programming you want to make that function run. Later on, you can call that function simply by writing the function's name with parentheses directly afterwards. Inside the parentheses should be any arguments that you gave it with just values. Some functions will want to return something of value. To do that, you would simply use return and whatever variable you had. Lists just store a ton of variables into one single name, like here, JPRPG, which is just Japanese RPG sales. It gives me a list of numbers, and it's all stored within this one value. Sadly, with my program, I never actually really used dictionaries, so I have nothing to show you about them. But dictionaries would give you the same as a list, but you would be able to call on it using specific titles or keys, whatever you want to call it. At the beginning of all this programming, we imported a lot of different modules, saved as smaller names so we can call on them later. This is all special programming that we use throughout this entire program to make things easier on us or show us specific visuals, like a plot. Here we can see a data. Skip this one. Here we can see a use of a data frame. First, we give it a variable, throw it into a process, which is really just another function that I have, which calls, skip this one. Here we can see a use of data frames. We have a data frame from using separate functions together to give ourselves one and read a file. We then use that data frame, we call it genre, and then we have to have it equal. Genre equals a specific type category. So it's all one type like an integer, but this time it's category. Like I said earlier, if you choose option 7, you'll actually see a bunch of answers to my data-driven questions with graphs showing answers to those. This is a graph on my survey on what people chose was popularity of certain genres in certain areas. Most of it is obviously high, with shooters being in American or Europe. Or this one, being sales by genre in Japan. Though it's kind of hard to see, role-playing is the top seller. Or this one, of the top 3 sellers all shown in one graph. Even more surprising to me is that Nintendo had nearly more than 3 times the amount of sales as the next publisher, Microsoft. And for my last data-driven question, we have these 3 graphs, showing in order the highest selling genre for each company. Nintendo actually had sports for the most selling. Activision, like I predicted, had shooter, and Sony actually had racing, which is very surprising to me. Like I had in my program, I have a finding and observations side in my Google Sites. The first observation simply just has a bunch of filtering of my data sets and a show of some tables. This one being for my survey, again, you've already seen this. And the same with this graph, which is actually from my data set, showing a sale of nearly 35 million in role-playing alone, which is much higher than everything else. Question 2, what publisher had the best releases per year? Was just one graph, seeing as Nintendo had nearly more than 3 times the last publisher, Microsoft. Question 3, showing what genre does each publisher usually release? Again, Nintendo, selling mostly sports, which surprised me. Activision, selling mostly shooters, which I guessed. And Sony, selling mostly racing, which is, again, very surprising to me. These graphs show that I was right on the first question, at least. Second question, I also had right. But for the third question, I had everything basically wrong, except for Activision. Nintendo sells mostly sports, which I can tell, or given more thought I could have thought of, knowing that Wii Sports is a very highly selling game. And Sony with racing, which I don't really keep up with Sony, so I didn't really have a way to guess that. That's it for my presentation on video game sales worldwide. Hope you found it at least fun to watch. Skip that part, that was bad. That concludes my presentation on video game sales worldwide.